Hi, everyone, and welcome to this special Foundations podcast, in which we will explore a bit deeper into the history of how we as a community of faith came to believe these foundational beliefs covered in this series. This podcast is one of several resources we are recommending to help you, your family, and your friends learn more about these foundational biblical beliefs, along with, of course, the videos provided. With that said, before jumping in, I want to mention one particular book that some may say is a classic when it comes to understanding the development of our beliefs. The book is by well known church historian Dr. George Knight, and it's called The Search for Identity: The Development of Seventh-day Adventist Beliefs. Now, if you've already read it some time ago, I encourage you to pick it back up and read it again. And if you've never read the book, well, of course, I'm encouraging you to go to Amazon or your local Adventist book center, pick it up. It will be well worth your money and time. And with that said, I now want to bring our special guest for this episode, who's going to be taking us on a historical journey. Pastor Matthew Lucio is a creator of the Adventist History Podcast, which we highly recommend as another resource. And he also pastors the Peoria Church in Illinois. Pastor Matthew, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Matthew, tell us a little bit about yourself as we get started here.
Yeah, well, I'm a pastor in Peoria, Illinois. And if you don't know where that is, everything in Illinois is judged by its relation to Chicago or 3ABN. So I'm like perfectly in between 3ABN in the south and Chicago in the north, a couple hours south of the city. And I host a podcast called the Adventist History Podcast.
So how long have you been pastoring there in Peoria?
I think I started, I want to say February of 18. So just in time to learn people's names before COVID hit.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we are thankful that you have decided to join us, help us as we are reminded and learn a little bit more about how we came to understand and believe these beautiful doctrines that we as a community of faith believe in. But before we get into that, I know that you also host a very popular podcast called Adventist History. So tell us a little bit about that. What led you to start that podcast?
So it started because when I began pastoring, people would ask me questions like, why do we do communion this way? Why does this happen this way? Why do we have our order of service this way? And I mean, I didn't know the answer to these questions. Contrary to popular belief, seminary does not tell you everything that you need to know to be a pastor. So I was frequently having to go back. And I don't know if people realize this, but there's a lot of Review and Herald articles in the history of the Adventist Church. So when you're going back into these days, it's a forest of ideas that you're having to navigate through. And I'm like, at some point, I just need to learn Adventist history because I'm constantly going back there to understand why we do what we do and what the purpose is of doing things this way and how it got started and all of that kind of stuff. And so I was like, I need to learn Adventist history, but I knew the only way this was going to happen is if I had a way of keeping myself accountable. So I thought a podcast is a great way to do this because if I do a monthly episode, people are going to expect something on a certain date. So that kind of puts that little bit of pressure on me that I need to make some progress here in learning Adventist history. And I'm still learning Adventist history after 7 years. It'll be 7 years this October. Doing this podcast, still learning it and having a lot of fun learning it.
Well, I love it. I want to encourage anybody that is listening right now. We'll also have links or a link to the podcast itself to go out and listen to it wherever you listen to podcasts. To make sure that you search for it, Adventist History Podcast by Matthew Lucio. It is a great podcast, and you're right, Matthew. We're all learning. You and I were talking before I press record that. As we were refreshing our memories on a lot of this history, it's like, I remember that, I forgot that. Oh yeah, that kind of emotions and thoughts as we were restudying a lot of these things that you and I have studied part through our studies, undergrad, graduate school at some level, but then on our own, right? I mean, you and I have been studying this
Right.
for a long time, and of course, you on a whole different level to get ready for your, monthly podcasts. And so, with that said, I think we have the right person here to help us in this journey. And so, let's begin into how we as a community of faith came to believe these biblical beliefs. And it's important to understand, right, that and be reminded that none of these beliefs arose in a vacuum. So let's start from the beginning, if that's okay, Matthew. Tell us a little bit about the well known, or at least well known within our community of faith, William Miller, and tell us about him, his calling. And for those that may not know, because we're hoping that this podcast will be for everybody, a reminder for those in our community of faith, and for those, searching, that this will be helpful, or at least a starter. By the way, I think Matthew and I will agree that we don't intend to cover every jot and tittle in this one podcast episode of all this history. So we're going to dig a little bit, but again, we're going to give you some other resources for you to research for yourself, and of course, for sure, go to Matthew's podcast. But with that said, with that little disclaimer, tell us about William Miller, his journey and calling, and why he is such an important figure as we get started in understanding how we came to believe these foundational truths.
Yeah. That's a good place to start. William Miller has a remarkably modern story, and I think people today don't quite realize it. We look back and we're like, these people are like 200 years old now. How could they possibly relate to me? William Miller can. William Miller is a guy who grew up in church. He had some preachers in his family, who was bored by church,
Yeah.
and eventually left and was out with a new group of friends, reading the Enlightenment writings of the day, right? That's what was in vogue, right? These young, smart, skeptical people. He became a deist, which is it's a fancy way of saying, yeah, I believe God exists, but he's just out there somewhere. He's not really getting involved in human affairs. So it's a way of saying, yeah, I think the universe was created, but God just doesn't care. So the whole Bible stuff, I mean, the only good part about it really is it can tell us that God is there somewhere, but he didn't come down to earth. He didn't create this. I should say he didn't maintain this creation and is intervening in human affairs, any of that kind of stuff. That's for children. Right? So he kind of took on this skeptical role, which, I think a lot of folks can relate to today. He didn't believe the things he was taught as a kid, but he had this really, really remarkable turnaround when he joined the War of 1812. And he was at the Battle of Plattsburgh, and the British were going to attack. The British, as usual in these wars against the British, heavily outnumbered the Americans, heavily outnumbered William Miller and his guys. And they were advancing upon the fort that Miller was holding down. And then to Miller, inexplicably, the British, in the middle of their advance, turned around and retreated. And he's like, I don't know how to interpret that other than providence, other than God doing something in human affairs, which is not what deists believe, right? So he began to think, I need to give the Bible a second look. And so that's his story. He grew up a Christian. He grew up a believer as a child. He went through a period of years where he's just like, never mind, that's for children. I don't believe that stuff anymore. He's skeptical. He's rational. And then he had a moment later on in life where he said, maybe I need to give this Christianity thing a second look.
And so that's fascinating, right? And so from there, how did he become so prominent in his belief, particularly in the second coming, right? That's the first foundational belief that we're going to cover here in the podcast as we flow through this with the other ones as well. But what led him to have this present truth, can I say that here? Present truth belief in the second coming.
Yeah. Well, part of that re-examining of Christianity was that he was going to go through the Bible verse by verse. And I think that really testifies as to what kind of person William Miller was, because he didn't just come to his conclusions flippantly. He didn't just say, well, I'll just kind of flip through the Bible here and see if I can find. He's just like, no, if I'm going to make the decision to give the Bible a second chance, to give God a second chance, then I'm going to go through this thing methodically. So he very famously, as I'm sure many Adventists know, he just had his Bible and he had Cruden's Concordance. Those are the only two books he used. And so if he didn't understand a word, he would try to look it up in the concordance and find it elsewhere and assemble kind of all the range of meanings of the word and do his best to try to understand it. And that was a very Enlightenment way of going about it too. It's kind of, I don't need experts. All I need is my own reason, my own God-given gifts, and I can just read through this book and the Bible will interpret itself. So he kind of developed his own principles of interpreting the Bible.
Right.
And he just went through it methodically. And when he got done, he knew the Bible better than a lot of other people. But one of the things, of course, that stuck out to him was when he got to the book of Daniel, and especially chapter 8 and verse 14, right? It talks about after 2,300 days, then the sanctuary will be cleansed. So that got him thinking, what are these 2,300 days? What is the sanctuary? What does it mean for the sanctuary to be cleansed? Very logical approach to this. And he came to the conclusion that sanctuary was the earth, and the cleansing of the earth meant cleansing it from sin. And what event in the Bible is about, coming and cleansing the earth of sin, and that's the second coming of Jesus.
Right.
So he thought, okay, that's what this is talking about. Now I just need to figure out when these 2,300 days start and end. Of course, as many Adventists would be familiar with, he came to the principle that a day in Bible prophecy equals a year. So this is 2,300 years. And he just needed to find a starting date, which he found in Daniel chapter 9, which is 457 BC. And that takes us to, drum roll, please, 1843. Right. If you said 1844, you were off.
Right.
He got to 1844 later, but he said about the year 1843 is when he figured that out. That was about 1818, I believe, that he came to that conclusion. People don't realize that. Like he figured this out. It wasn't like he figured it out in 1840. He figured it out a long time before, and then he sat on it.
Well, that's, let me put a pin there for a second, because that's just right there, just to learn a little bit about William Miller, right? It is fascinating. The fact that clearly and obviously in a day where there's no Google, nothing of that, of course, just the reminder of the power to just sit and read your Bible with a concordance. I mean, imagine if, some of us did that today, which I would venture to say, many of us have actually at certain levels. Of course, we have so many tools now, right? Online as well. But just the power of sitting and reading God's word. And so I think it's worth to just pause for a moment and be reminded of the beauty of that, just to read for oneself through prayer and constant study, long study, right? Not just devotional thoughts, which is great, or devotional time, which is wonderful, and we should all do it, but also study time. Is that fair to you? Is that fair to say, Matthew? What do you think?
Yeah, I think the thing that I admire about William Miller is first of all, the enterprise he undertook to study the Bible was inherently optimistic.
Yeah,
I can understand this book. This book wants to be understood, and if I just apply myself, have some very basic principles of interpretation, I can understand it. I don't need experts. I don't need PhDs. We're thankful for those people. Right. He wasn't disparaging the scholars, but he's just like, I need to do this for myself. And I think it's daunting, right? Because he put a couple of years into it there and got to Daniel 8. And then after he came to that conclusion, he actually spent the next 5 years saying, I need to look at this from every angle and anticipate every objection to what I've concluded and make sure that it's solid. Then he spoke. That's not the way I operate. I find a verse that inspires me. I'm on Twitter, or Facebook or something in like 2 seconds.
Yeah.
The idea of like thinking it through and spending more time in the Bible, saying, I just want to be sure. So let me read it again for 5 years before I start putting my ideas out there. It's just the discipline of it, the inherent optimism in that. I think really just captivates me. It's like, I need to be more like that.
I love that. And so as long as as well as learning, the essence of how he came to understand the second coming, the sanctuary, I just think it's well worth us taking the moment to learn of the person, right? And as you mentioned, and I love what you said there, the discipline to kind of sit with the text and sit with what one is learning. And so I'm really thankful that you bring that out. So back to William Miller. And he now it's 1818. He sits on it. He continues studying this. When does he begin to proclaim this? When does he begin to preach this? Right
Yeah.
in a time. And tell us a little bit, maybe briefly, about the context of the day. I think it's worth
Yeah.
noting as we progress forward with the history that that played a big role as well. Would you say?
Yeah. Definitely. I think in a modern sense, we look back on William Miller and we're like, that's crazy. I mean, this was a guy running around saying Jesus is going to come in such and such a year.
Yeah.
But people don't realize that William Miller was very much a part of a society where, even though that claim is startling, it is not normal. We don't have that all the time. It's not that abnormal. There were a number of people who, well, let me just put it this way. This is part of the Second Great Awakenings.
Right.
Some scholars like to have that be in the plural. It's a series of revivals going around America that tends to be shifting power from one group of churches, like the Anglicans or Episcopalians here in America. It's switching power away from them, which happened before the Revolutionary War, over to the Baptists and the Methodists after the Revolutionary War. These are more evangelical churches, and they're growing like crazy during this time. There's an emphasis on conversion, an emphasis on reforming your life. It's moving away from the Calvinism of the Puritans. So now with this revivalism, with this evangelicalism, the idea is you can make yourself and your world a better place. So stop doing, stop smoking, stop drinking. This stuff will come.
Yeah.
And so one of the founders of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, somebody who worked relatively closely with William Miller, was Joseph Bates. Bates formed anti-slavery societies. This is part of that mood in America. He formed them in the 1830s. Several of them, his wife helped form one. It was kind of like a family industry. And so the idea was like, we can reform this country. We can reform ourselves. And so Miller's preaching, Miller's idea of the second coming of Jesus was a part of this mood of, we can reform this place. It seems a little strange to think of it that way, but there was an inherent spiritual optimism in the air of like, God can give me the victory over this. I can get over this. I can learn how to study the Bible for myself, right? Like, I can do all these things with his help. We can help free people who need to be freed in this country. We can help people who need help in this area. And one of the things that would do that is the knowledge that Jesus is coming soon. Like, hey guys, this is the time to free the slaves. Jesus is coming back. You don't want to be caught with chains in your hand when Jesus returns, right? So it's kind of like this. These all worked fairly well together. And I think it's, George Knight in like all of his books, being a little bit facetious there, likes to quote the historian Ernest Sandine as saying that America was drunk on the millennium, which is another aspect of what's going on back then. They expected 1,000 years of peace to come, and they may not have explicitly stated it this way, but the idea was that we could accomplish this if we just, you look at America and how different it was from the old world in Europe, and different from many other nations in the world at this time. And there was this idea of, we started something new here, something that's better, that all the world should be emulating what we're doing here. This is before we've all become a little bit more jaded, I think. But there's that optimism, right? Like that this is the new prototype, and we're on our way to the millennium. We're going to make maybe not a reasonably perfect country here, a society together. And so, Miller was a little bit of, he kind of tapped into that spirit a little bit, that we're making progress spiritually, socially, civically, we're making progress. And this is something that God has enabled us to do. So, I think people have a hard time, I think, today understanding how issues of social justice, like freeing the slaves, like women's suffrage, things like that, how they would it seems kind of antithetical to the idea that Jesus is coming soon. Like, either you fix the world or you're looking for the second coming to get out of the world. You can't do both. But they did both. They were heavily involved in both. And I think that's something people miss today.
Yeah. So no, thank you for that. It's important to kind of give that cultural background as well, in which William Miller and others are living in. as he begins to preach that Jesus is coming soon, as he begins to preach the message of the sanctuary. And so what happens from there? We have what we call the 7-month movement. So maybe tell us a little bit
Uh.
about that. And then what happens, obviously, spoiler alert, not so much. Jesus does not come. So I'm kind of fast forwarding just a little bit. Yeah. So, yeah, tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. So, Miller was a very famously reluctant preacher. He didn't want to, he, like anyone could imagine today, if you felt this was the truth, but you're like, I'm not going to go say that. I'm going to be laughed off the stage.
Yeah.
They're going to ban me on Facebook if I start preaching this. I don't want to lose my friends. The people that Miller kind of told around him didn't really buy into it. And so he's like, well, but he felt that he had to do something, right? He felt that push in his life. So he said, all right, Lord, if you want me to talk about this, I will. But you're going to have to send someone to invite me. And so he felt a little better after making that deal with God. But of course, somewhere up in heaven, God is smiling at this covenant that Miller is proposing, because little does Miller know that while he's making this deal with God, somebody's already on his way to Miller's house to invite him to come preach the next day.
Yeah.
So Miller does that. And it kind of goes slowly for a few years. That was in the early 1830s. By the end of the 1830s, things start picking up because Miller meets a guy named Joshua Himes. And Himes is like, he's just a marketing genius. He really is, for back in the day. He's Miller's hype man.
Right.
And so he does a really good job of just getting Miller out there, building a network, forming a general conference of these Millerites who agree. And so it pulls in a lot of diverse people. Some years ago, there was a study that the Millerite movement was like 44% Methodist, 27% Baptist, 9% Congregational. Like it was
interesting.
It's an interdenominational movement. And Miller was very adamant of, I'm not trying to form a new denomination here. This is for all Christians. You don't even have to leave your church to believe that Jesus is coming soon. You can stay in your churches at first.
Right.
But there started to be a little bit of pressure, of course, from these churches. And so some of them, like Ellen White, or Ellen Harmon before she was married, her family felt pushed out of their Methodist church because of this belief in the soon return of Jesus.
Yeah.
So yes, 1843, Miller finally said, I think it's probably going to be between spring of March of 1843 and the March of 1844. Somewhere in that time, Jesus is going to come. And as you said, Jesus doesn't come. And, this was called the spring disappointment. And no doubt it was disappointing. But I think people may have the impression that these people are just kind of like moping around their house and, like not sure how to go on with their lives.
Yeah.
But they always knew. And Miller was very, very adamant about this, that he always says, if I didn't make an error in my calculations, Jesus should return about this time. He never set a specific day, ever.
That's important.
It is important.
Yeah.
And it was never really about the date. That's the thing that we latch on to. We latch on to October 22nd, 1844, which is what it ended up being in the end. But it was never about the date to them. It was always about the idea that Jesus was coming soon. And you'll find statements from Joshua Himes, you'll find statements from Miller, from others who say, even if it's not this date, I still know it's coming soon. It could be a few more years from now. It could be, a few more months. It could be whatever. But I still believe Jesus is coming soon. The date was kind of a secondary thing, or the time frame was kind of a secondary thing. The most important thing was believing that Jesus was coming soon. And that's why they didn't, Miller and others were not, I'm sure they were disappointed Jesus didn't come in the spring. But, they went on. They didn't really skip a beat. Things kept going. So you're right. So go ahead.
So I really appreciate that. So we get to the point of 1844. You mentioned October. How briefly tell us how they came to October 22nd, 1844, and the 7-month movement. I think it's important as we kind of begin, right? So we've talked about the second coming, the sanctuary, and we're spending a little bit more time on this because really it's speaking of foundations, right? It's kind of the foundational beliefs in the history of our community of faith that leads things forward, right? Obviously, second coming, sanctuary, tied together. But the understanding of that, as you've already mentioned, began to evolve, particularly the essence of the sanctuary, what that meant, what was being cleansed. And so Jesus doesn't come. There is this spring disappointment, as you mentioned. But the focus is still there. Jesus is coming. Then they continue to study the Bible more, and they come to the 7-month movement that leads to the
Mm-hmm.
fall, autumn of
Mm-hmm.
1844. So let's pick it up
Right.
there.
Okay.
And then when Jesus doesn't come, obviously, in October 22nd.
Boy, really dropping those spoilers. I mean, who's
Yeah,
going to go
yeah.
to theaters to see this film? Yeah. So what happened is they didn't really have an explanation. Miller had kind of thrown one out before the spring disappointment, but it didn't really get much traction. He suggested that maybe his return is aligned with the feasts, because of course Jesus died in Passover. Pentecost, we know this was when the Holy Spirit came. So these are the spring feasts, but the ones that Jesus didn't fulfill were the autumn feasts. And so Day of Atonement was one of those autumn feasts. And so Miller even himself suggested maybe the Day of Atonement is kind of the type, or that gets met in Jesus, his second return. So, but didn't really get anywhere because they were still hoping for the spring. In August, Joseph Bates is at a camp meeting. They're still kind of looking for answers, even in August. And Joseph Bates is preaching. He's preaching a good old message that Millerites have been preaching for years. This is in Exeter, New Hampshire. And a woman interrupts him in the middle of the sermon. So if there's any preachers out there who are listening or watching, you're feeling this right now. Interrupts him in the middle of the sermon and basically tells Bates, we've heard, this is a great sermon. We've heard this sermon before. It's time, but that's like yesterday's sermon. We need some truth for right now.
Yeah.
Nothing wrong with it, but that's not for this moment. That was for yesterday or last week or whatever. And so Bates, I mean, can you imagine how Bates must feel up there on the spot right now? It's like, what do you want from me, lady?
Yeah.
Just let me finish, right? But anyway, she said, here we have a guy by the name of Samuel Snow, and he's got a word for this moment. And Bates, I mean, to his credit, he's like, okay. I don't know how many preachers would be really eager to just kind of step aside in the middle of their sermon and let somebody they may or may not know very well take the pulpit and preach their own sermon.
Yeah.
That's a recipe that's a lot of trust. So give Bates his credit there, that he stepped aside and Samuel Snow got up and basically said what Miller had said before, that we should expect Jesus to come not in the spring, but in the fall in the antitypical Day of Atonement, which that year would fall on October 22nd, 1844. So that's what began the 7th month movement. It doesn't mean the movement lasted 7 months, because of course this is August and we've got to get to October.
Yeah.
It's that the Day of Atonement is in the 7th month of the Jewish calendar.
Right. And so we see here that William Miller, again, wasn't in a vacuum, coming full circle to how I started, that you have other players coming in. You just mentioned, Snow, obviously Himes. And so this preaching begins. People begin to preach that Jesus is coming October 22nd, 1844. The understanding of the sanctuary message is progressing now at this point. Jesus, here it is again. Let's make it official now. Jesus doesn't come in October 22nd, 1844. So what is the mood now? What is going on, and what happens in that context, in that time, with William Miller and the others that have been preaching that Jesus is coming, but doesn't come?
Yeah, it definitely impacts everybody, but people react to it in different ways. Miller definitely gave up, saying, because he didn't accept October 22nd until October 6th. Okay, so
that's a great point, and I'm glad that you brought it up, because I was going to bring it up if you didn't, but I'm glad you did, and that's really interesting, and you gave it a specific date, October 6th. Oftentimes we don't even hear that date, but it's important to know that the guy, can I say the guy who started it? Can I say that?
Sure.
Didn't really believe on that date until October 6th, 16 days before supposedly Jesus was coming. So thank you for pointing that out.
Yeah. So, I think it's important to realize it's like Miller is not this kind of mad scientist behind here trying to set dates and stuff.
Right.
But he kind of reluctantly accepted it, like, well, it seems like it's as good a date. If you're going to pick one, it seems like that would be the right one. So he was rather insulated, I think, because he always, again, he and Himes and others always were like, hey, it's not about this specific time. They were obviously hoping for Jesus and even expecting Jesus to come then, but it didn't ruin their faith. It didn't introduce a crisis of faith. Miller at one point said that he said, some of my brethren preached with great positiveness the exact year that Jesus would return, and later on, of course, the specific day. And he says they censured me for putting in an if, like if my calculations are correct. So I think we see in the seventh month movement kind of a takeover of some of the more junior members of the Millerite cause. Like they were pushing Miller, like, no, be more specific, take a firm stand on a date. And he was always just kind of like, I'll just reluctantly accept October 22nd. So he did. He was fine afterwards, but he's like, after that, I don't know. My new life motto is just to be ready today and today and today for Jesus to return. I'm done even entertaining the idea that it's going to be a certain date. And that's what he lived for the rest of his life. Others, of course, had a crisis of faith. They would leave. Still others kind of went back to the drawing board. This is where our Seventh-day Adventist pioneers come from. What happened?
Yeah.
What,
Yeah. Yeah, so that's a good segue here to as we continue to progress forward, and I think it's important to I want to read this quote here from George Knight, premier retired history professor, many in our community of faith, of course, very well known history professor, but in his book A Search for Identity, which I highly recommend, or we're going to get some other resources for people to read, but he states this on page 18. He says, to adequately understand Adventism's doctrinal development, we need to examine three concepts espoused by the earliest Seventh-day Adventist thought leaders. Now, we're not going to I'm going to state them here, but we're not going to cover every aspect of this. But I think it's important to read this quote because it's kind of what we're talking about. Not kind of, it is, right? The essence of it here. So here it is. Number one, he says, their dynamic conception of present truth. Two, their attitude toward creedal statements of Christian belief. And three, their view of the pathway to progressive understanding, right? And he means here progressive, not in the term that, in our world today, we would mean progressive. He means that understanding obviously grows. And that's what was happening in this early time in the pioneers of our community of faith, right? So they're learning, they're studying. Jesus doesn't come, and you have this group, as you mentioned, that goes back to the drawing board, and the drawing board is the Bible. And so take us from there. How do they come to the new understanding of what it meant for the sanctuary to be cleansed?
Yeah, so that's a really good quote from George. Of course, everything George writes, there's a really good quote in there somewhere.
By the way, for those that are listening, Matthew and I are very biased. We really appreciate Dr. George Knight's massive contribution to Adventist history. Can I say that, Matthew? I just did, so it's there. It's said.
Yeah, well, I tell you, just on a personal level, what annoys me in a loving way about George Knight is that he's able to write like 120-page books that are
by hand.
Yeah, by hand. Like, good grief, man.
Yeah.
that are really impactful. They're not like light. That you'd be better off with some 700-page book. Like he can pack it in there in a very, very beautiful way. So anyways, so that question of what happened is the dominant question on October 23rd, the day after, the morning after. Of course, the Millerites, you can imagine, they're having so much mockery heaped upon them by the general public, even by former Millerites who are like, what was wrong with me? Why did I join that movement? These people are crazy. And so they're under a lot of fire. They're keeping their heads down for the most part. There's a funny story. I say funny. It's funny now, I think, where Joseph Bates was being mocked as he was walking around like, hey, why didn't you go up to heaven? Blah, 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 Didn't Jesus come to get you? And Joseph Bates apparently turns around on this person and says, and if I would have gone up to heaven, where would you have gone yesterday?
Mercy.
Don't mess with Joseph Bates, guys.
Oh, wow.
But this is what they're having to deal with. I imagine he's just walking somewhere and having a heckler come up to him, and so there's an immense pressure on them to try to understand the nature of this disappointment. It's not like it's, as you were saying earlier, it's not like it's in a vacuum
Right.
where they just have time and space. They're under pressure. There's public pressure on them and also an internal pressure stemming from their disappointment to sort this out. Now, the moment that really begins to open the door for this is actually the day after. It's a man by the name of Hiram Edson. He was walking with a friend on his farm. They had just been praying all October 22nd, and they were praying in the morning, into the morning hours, like, Lord, what happened? What's going on, Lord? And it says that he was walking through his field. He felt something like a hand on his shoulder, and he looks up to the sky, and it says that he saw the heavenly sanctuary. And this is the moment that really kind of helped him understand what's going on here. Now, I don't know if that's a literal vision or if it's just kind of his understanding was opened. It was a flash of divine insight, and his writing doesn't exactly make that super clear. But what that did begin in true Millerite Adventist fashion, lowercase a Adventist fashion, it began a Bible study.
Amen.
And the guy
went back to the Bible.
He went back to the Bible.
Yeah.
And he's like, and it lasted like a good year. He's publishing updates in a local paper as he goes. He's trying, I need to understand this sanctuary, because we built this whole movement on the idea that the sanctuary is going to be cleansed, and we assumed that sanctuary was the earth. Obviously, that doesn't seem to be true. So what is the sanctuary that was cleansed? And so that's what that Bible study was all about, trying to understand it. So that flash of insight, that vision, whatever it is he had, seeing a sanctuary in heaven was like hey, the sanctuary doesn't have to mean the earth. There's a sanctuary in heaven, because, of course, we're told that when Moses built his sanctuary in the wilderness, it was patterned after one that he saw that God had shown him. So there must be a sanctuary in heaven. So that was kind of his starting place for this Bible study, trying to understand what's going on here. And, of course, he ultimately concludes that it wasn't that Jesus, the cleansing and sanctuary wasn't that Jesus was going to be returning at that time, but that he was beginning a new ministry in the heavenly sanctuary as our great high priest on the Day of Atonement.
Okay. And clearly that's the game changer there. That is when everything now, again, to George Knight's comment that I just read, progressive understanding of truth, right? So it went from the understanding that the earth was going to be cleansed to the understanding that Jesus and the heavenly sanctuary was in a different ministerial department. Can I say that in today's terminology, department? But that a whole new level was happening here biblically. And I just, I want to reiterate the fact that of what we just did is that they always went back to the Bible. Though we often mention Hiram Edson's, vision and so on, as you just did, but ultimately it wasn't just from that. It was from the Word of God and their continuous study of God's Word. So there's so much more that we can say about how they continue to understand this essence of Jesus's ministry in the heavenly sanctuary. And again, I want to encourage people to read A Search for Identity. And there's another book that you want to recommend. Let's go ahead and just do that now. What's you're going to show it there on the camera?
Yeah, it's an oldie but a goodie.
Yes.
Mervyn Maxwell's Tell It to the World is, I think it has the great quality of being very readable. Yes. And it's fun to read. Maxwell, of course, is a fantastic author, and this is a good one too. You probably had it if you were in college anytime in the last 30 years. You probably had this as a textbook. So still a good one.
So we want to highly encourage people. Again, we're not going to be able to cover every jot and tittle of the theological aspects of all these beliefs. So we're just trying to help you with this podcast to dig a little deeper and, of course, explore. That is the essence of Foundations, exploring the basis of our hope. So you have two great resources there. And for those that have read these books, let me tell you, I just was rereading Search for Identity. And again, as I said at the beginning, there were just some incredible nuggets that I knew, but I was reminded of. And I'm like, man, I have a lot of sermons that I can get from this, biblical sermons, but the historical aspects, of course, as well. So speaking of progressive truth, okay, so we have the second coming, we have the sanctuary, and again, more can be said about that. How does the Sabbath become prominent in our understanding of what Sabbath is within our community of faith,
Yeah,
right? The
yeah.
Seventh-day Sabbath I'm talking about.
Right, right. So the Sabbath came around through the Seventh-day Baptists, who've been around since the mid 1600s. And Knight, one of his contributions to this topic is that he makes this point that the Seventh-day Baptists finally got serious about evangelizing other Christians and trying to convert them over to keeping the Sabbath. Around the time of the Millerite movement. They formed a general conference in the early 1800s and were kind of building organization through that time. And at this point, they're like, hey, we want to tell other people about the Sabbath. And the group of Christians who were very liable to listen to them, at least to give them a hearing, were the Millerites. Because the Millerite movement, as I've said, was a kind of an interdenominational movement. Miller just cared that you believed that Jesus was returning soon. And then whatever you believed about other things in the Bible, he wasn't going to be dogmatic about. So these were, people who were attracted to the Millerite movement were people who were open-minded, who were willing to think differently outside of creeds, outside of their belief statements of their particular denomination. So they tended to be more open-minded people religiously. So that's where the Sabbath found some ground in the Millerites. But while they were still looking for 1843 and 1844, the idea was like, well, if Jesus is coming, there's no point really agitating about the Sabbath too much right now. So
they didn't feel, the earlier Millerites, can I say it that way? They didn't feel the Sabbath was in essence present truth. Can I say that? Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, I think the people who were convinced of it saw it as important.
Okay.
But it just, if Jesus is going to come in a few months,
right.
There's no way we can tell the whole world about this anyway. So obviously it's going to be okay. So a lot of these ideas that would show up later, like the State of the Dead, which we'll get to, like the Sabbath, are ideas that existed before 1844, before the Great Disappointment, but they were kind of kept in check because, again, if Jesus comes, then what's the point of really pushing this too hard? And only after the disappointment, you're like, well, it looks like we've got a little bit more time. So let's start talking about this and understanding these things.
And I'm just going to jump in really quick. Just with what you said, it's very important once again to say, some people may believe we're just, Adventists came up with all these beliefs, but really, I'm going to go back to the same thing I said, and George Knight mentions it. It just isn't happening in a vacuum. It's not like the Sabbath and what happens when we die. There weren't people that were already believing these biblical truths. It's just that as truth began to progress and become more into the light, can I say it that way? It just seemed like God was guiding in different ways as time was going on. So you got the second coming, the sanctuary, and then the Sabbath again, because of the Seventh-day Baptists. It begins to draw prominence. But maybe the question is, why did it begin to have such a prominent feature within our community of faith early on and even to this day? I mean, there's no way of getting around the fact because we are called Seventh-day Adventist, right? So this is a absolute pillar of who we are, our identity in part, right? So, but why early on, why did it become so important?
Well, it became important in part because of Joseph Bates.
Okay.
Joseph Bates, as I've said before, involved in anti-slavery societies. He was a vegetarian. He never met a cause that he couldn't adopt and champion. He was just a man always looking for like the next cause, the next truth. And so he found the Sabbath. He found the Sabbath because he read a tract and by T.M. Preble. And he then began studying the Sabbath himself, and then he began advocating for it to everybody that he met. Yeah. I mean, Joseph Bates was the guy who just show up at your house, Javier, at 6:00 at night and wouldn't leave until the next morning. Like you guys would be in Bible study the whole night. Like if he just came over, you'd be studying the Sabbath all night long.
What year was this?
What year did Bates take up the Sabbath?
Yeah, approximately, give or take.
Yeah, Preble published his tract in 1845, and Bates really started picking up with it after that, and especially in 1846.
Okay, so it's just 2 years after Jesus not coming in 1844, right? So just to kind of give people a time frame. And so
Yeah.
Bates is just now, he's enthralled by the Sabbath. He accepts the Sabbath, right?
Yeah.
Take it from there.
Yeah. He accepts it. He tries to persuade other people. He tries to persuade Ellen and James White, who got married in August of 1846. And at first, Ellen's like, why are you making such a big deal about one commandment over the others, right? If you're an Adventist, you've heard somebody say that at some point.
Yeah.
And it's really funny to hear that, that was Ellen White's first reaction to the Sabbath. Like, why are you making such a big deal about this one thing over the other? Because again, they're looking for Jesus to come soon. And it's like, well, how does the Sabbath fit in to this belief? Like, why is it so urgent? It's not that it's not true. It's just like, why does this got to be something that demands my attention and my devotion right now?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, there's a lot of truth in the Bible, but we don't kind of champion all of them with the same kind of fervor. There's some truths that it's like, these are most urgent that people need to hear.
Mm-hmm.
I don't walk around being like, Noah waited for 120 years. I need to make sure I mention that every single sermon, right? Like that's the truth in the Bible, but it's not the most prominent truth in the Bible. And so I think, the reaction with James and Ellen is kind of like, well, even if you're right, Bates, I mean, it's not really that big of a deal. It's not the biggest truth in the Bible, but he managed to persuade them. He got them by the end of that year. And they saw it. And what Bates did that the Seventh-day Baptists didn't do was that Bates connected the Sabbath to Revelation.
Yeah, very
He
important.
saw it as an issue of worship to God in these last days. And once he did that, okay, now these other Adventists are understanding it.
Revelation 14:12, right?
Yeah, Revelation 14:12 is one of those texts that he picks up on and sees the Sabbath in it. And, and it also fits into this restorationist idea. Like, the purpose of this Advent movement is to restore truths that have been lost. Mm-hmm. The Sabbath being one of those. And that these are things that need to be reclaimed, that need to be rediscovered before Jesus comes, right? So it's kind of like we're the early church kind of reborn in these last days. We're going to shed off tradition and ideas that we've accumulated along the way that have no business in Christianity. We're going to get rid of those things, and we're going to rediscover the truth that God has for us. And the Sabbath fit the bill as one of those things that had been lost in Christian history and was now being refound in the last days.
So, very importantly, this fit into their prophetic understanding with Revelation, really from Revelation 11:19 through Revelation 14:12, the three angels' message that we're not really going to cover in this episode. Like I said, we're not going to cover everything here, but the Sabbath draws that prominence, right? So most of Christianity, I can say it that way, correct me if I'm wrong, was commandment keeping people, except for that fourth commandment, which they saw as the seventh-day Sabbath. And to your point, and in this, Reformationist, they felt like the Reformation hadn't gone all the way, right? And so the Sabbath needed to be restored to what it was biblically, the seventh-day Sabbath. And so this is the mind frame. This is the biblical mind frame that they had. And so we've covered the second coming, the sanctuary, the Sabbath at some level. Again, I'm going to repeat this a few times. A lot more can we say, because I know I'm going to get somebody that said, well, you guys didn't cover this. And I'm going to say, I'm sorry, but here's some great resources that we just mentioned where you can read about it there and then some. There's a lot of more resources as well, which we're going to have links to. But so we've covered three at some level. Mm-hmm. How did, as we call it, the state of the dead, what happens when you die? How did that now become into our we're making a big shift here, but for the sake of time, how did the state of the dead come into play?
Yeah, that's the weirdest one, because you think to yourself, you're looking for Jesus to come. You're talking about, people understand the second coming. I think it's like, oh, Jesus is coming, we should get ready. They understand the Sabbath in terms of why this is a good thing. It's a commandment. It's written on stone. It gives me a day of rest. We understand, but it's like, how did the idea of what happens when you die become a prominent question in this age? And I mean, of course, it was for a number of reasons. Much closer to them than us, their lifespans were shorter. Right, death was always there was no guarantees, especially back then. So the idea of death always was nearer to them, I think, than it is to us. but also it's not, we call it the state of the dead. Really, it's a question of the nature of human beings.
Correct.
And that's really what it comes down to. And the kind of technical term that gets thrown around to describe the Adventist belief is conditional immortality.
Yes.
You don't have an immortal soul. Immortality is a gift from God. So what that means, of course, is, for those who may not know, you're not burning in hell forever.
Mm-hmm.
And if the only place you're going to live forever is in the presence of God, because He alone possesses immortality. So that's the conclusion that they got to on the nature of the soul. And this, of course, has been developed since then into this Adventist emphasis on the holistic person, right?
Yeah.
Mind and body and spirit, however you want to word it. We're worried about all of those things with a person.
Who were some of the major players that helped in the development of this understanding, this biblical understanding of conditional mortality?
Yeah.
Conditional being, as you said, believing in Jesus by faith through grace, and we'll more about that in just a moment. But who were some of the players that helped in this understanding?
Yeah, so the big guy in the Millerite movement was George Storrs.
Mm-hmm.
He's the one who came to this. He came upon a tract by a guy named Henry Grew, who lived in Philadelphia. And this was a guy who kind of he was a preacher, but he got kicked out of his church, probably, at least in part, for his belief in conditional immortality. He wrote a tract, as people did, and George Storrs happened upon it. He began studying the issue for about 3 years. Again, you're sensing the theme here that when people encounter an idea, they go at it for a while and sort through it in the Bible. So he studied it. Again, this is part of the Millerite movement. He's a big guy in the Millerite movement. He manages to convince another Millerite preacher. But again, this wasn't, we're not going to push this thing too hard because Jesus is about to come soon. So again, those seeds are there.
Right.
Those seeds are there. Joseph Bates and James White probably didn't need much pushing on this issue because they were from the Christian Connection, which is a kind of denomination back then, and they tended to believe this already. So it really wasn't news to them. Ellen White was a Methodist, and of course they did believe in the immortal soul. But Ellen White is unique, or Ellen Harmon, before she's married. She's unique because for those who are familiar with her life, she really wrestled as a young girl with the idea of somebody burning in hell forever. She didn't feel like she was worthy of Jesus. She didn't know if she was sick all the time. She's like, man, if I die tonight, am I going to burn forever? Like, that's terrifying to a young girle.
Right.
It's terrifying to me.
It's terrifying to anybody. Yeah.
Yeah. And so it really vexed her. And her mom, it seems, Ellen's mom, Eunice, had attended a Christian Connection meeting in town. And so she came home, and Ellen overheard her mom talking to Ellen's sister about this idea that we don't have an immortal soul, that you're not going to go straight to hell or when you die and burn forever and ever and ever, that immortality is a gift from God only. And so Ellen was like, do you really believe this, Mom? And, her mom's like, well, yeah, I do see the merit in it. And Ellen said, well, then please don't tell anybody, because if people don't believe in an eternal hell, then who's going to want to turn to Jesus? And her mom said something I think that was really insightful. Her mom said, if it's the truth, it will lead people to Jesus, not away from him.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah. Ellen thought about that for a few months, and eventually she came around to that. So even before the Great Disappointment, you had Joseph Bates, James White, and Ellen Harmon were all on board with conditional immortality, but they just kind of kept it laid low, right, until we found out if Jesus was going to come back or not.
So they accept this, and these early Adventists right now, compiled of, at this point, by the time they're accepting what happens when we die. It's about, according to George Knight, and then I'm just going to read it here. He says, by early 1848, the Sabbatarian Adventist leaders, he says, through both extensive and intensive, I love his wording there, extensive and intensive Bible study, had come to basic agreement on at least, at this point, 4 points of doctrine, right, which we have just talked about. The personable, visible, premillennial return of Jesus. Number 2, the two-phase ministry of Christ in the heavenly sanctuary that we mentioned. Number 3, the perpetuity of the seventh-day Sabbath and its end-time importance, revelation. And number 4, the concept that immortality is not inherent, but something that comes only as a gift through Christ. So it's really fascinating that by 1848, according to George Knight, just 4 years after October 22nd, 1844, Jesus doesn't come, the great disappointment as we're known within our community of faith. They've developed these foundational beliefs that this series studies in just 4 years. But then there's one more that we cover, and it's we call it the spirit of prophecy, right? And now this is Ellen White. And so tell us a little bit about um, why the need to develop this essence, right? At this point, Ellen White has had visions, but it's not like everybody immediately was believing in Ellen White, right? So tell us a little bit about that and how they came to understand uh, the gift of prophecy.
Yeah. So this is a really interesting thing because I would guess that even many Adventists don't realize it took a long time for Ellen White to occupy the kind of position that we're used to her occupying. Yeah, the first leader in the church was Joseph Bates. The second one was James White. It isn't until the 1880s that both of those men are now gone, and Ellen White is the one of the three founders who was left, and her writings are now being disseminated more and more widely. In the early years, she was not the top dog,
Yeah.
among these three. She was in 1844. She was a 17-year-old girl, and that's when, at the very end of the year, in December of 1844, 2 months after the disappointment, she had her first vision. The Millerite people were not, Miller, especially himself, was not really. He was worried about this kind of stuff. There had been Millerites before who claimed to have special revelations and stuff, and he was always very insistent that we're going to proceed rationally and logically through a study of the Bible. He didn't discount that God could speak in this way. He himself had a dream earlier on in his life when he was reluctant to preach, where he felt God was pushing him to preach. He would have a dream after the Great Disappointment, a few years after, a very famous dream that Ellen White and James White would later on repeat. So he understood that God can speak to us in this way. He was just cautious, as many people were then and now, about believing people who claim to have visions and dreams and that sort of thing. So she has her first vision in December. This is a vision, the very, very famous one. We've illustrated it. We've talked about it an awful lot as Adventists. It's about the Advent people who are on this path that goes higher and higher and higher above the earth. And she says in that dream that if they keep their eyes upon Jesus, they'll arrive safely in the holy city. But of course, many people don't. They take their eyes off Jesus. They fall by the wayside, that kind of thing. And so she doesn't just kind of run around saying, "Hey guys, I had a vision. Listen to me, listen to me, listen to me."
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, she's nervous about that too. She's a girl. She's a teenage girl. And this is an age where people are even less inclined to listen to women.
Right.
And so she's of course very nervous about going out there too. She does go around and start speaking, trying to encourage the Advent believers. She does tell some people about this. Young man James White does listen to him, and he does believe her. And so he lends his support to her cause, but all the while insisting, guys, we didn't arrive at any of these beliefs because Ellen had a dream about it or a vision about it. We arrived at them because we studied the Bible. But what she has to say is going to lend itself to our encouragement and edification and all those things. So let's give her a listen. He helps her print out an account of that dream. There's several versions of it. She first sends an article into a paper, but then he gets it printed in a broadside and sends it out to people as well, because he thought what she has to say is important. Of course, many people are skeptical. Joseph Bates is skeptical at first. In 1846, Joseph's trying to convince them about the Sabbath, and they're trying to convince him about Ellen White's visions, right? And at first, neither of them are getting anywhere. But by the end of the year, Joseph gets to witness her in vision and becomes convinced. And they become convinced about the Sabbath. So it wasn't Ellen White's calling as a prophet, is how it, kind of became understood, that she was receiving these messages from God, was not anything that it's like, you guys need to believe this or you don't belong at first. This wasn't a test of fellowship, right? And it never was meant to be.
Right.
They were focused on these doctrines. In fact, for a while, James White refused, when he started his newspaper, The Present Truth and then Review and Herald, he refused to print accounts of her visions for a few years because he's like, I don't want people to think that this is what this is all about that we're doing here. This came from a study of the Bible, not from her, but he still believed in them.
Yeah, and that's where I was going. What were some of the texts that they used to solidify biblically that Ellen White had the gift of prophecy?
Well, they had some tests for her, nothing formal, right? But they read their Bible first of all. They saw the phrase "spirit of prophecy" comes from Revelation 19, verse 20, where John is tempted to worship this angel, and the angel says, "Worship God, for the spirit of prophecy, for it is the spirit of prophecy who bears testimony to Jesus."
Right.
So the spirit of prophecy idea is like the person who has this spirit of prophecy is somebody who's testifying of Jesus. So that was an important thing. What is their focus? Are they having visions that help you get rich? Or telling you who's going to win the election? No. The focus of these visions has to be on leading people to Jesus. So that's kind of like one easy check mark that you can check off there. They also reread the Bible about these spiritual gifts, and they're like, hey, 1 Corinthians 14 says, eagerly desire gifts of the Spirit, especially prophecy, Paul says. So obviously these gifts are still being given out. Right. And prophecy doesn't mean that Ellen White had a long beard and lived out in the wilderness.
Right.
It just means that somebody who has been given, God has given them something to say.
Yeah. And would you say that they also equated it to the essence of, that before Jesus comes in Joel chapter 2, right, that there would be gifts handed out, and that she was one of those that received this specific gift. But along with that, to your point, what you mentioned earlier is that none of these beliefs, right? So the spirit of prophecy is a biblical belief, and the conclusion was that she had the gift of the spirit of prophecy, right? Which at the end of the day it was to lead everything back to Jesus and the word. And so everything needed to be tested by that. Anything that she said needed to be tested by that. And so I think that's quintessentially important, right? In the history, one, that none of our beliefs came specifically from Ellen White. Everything came from the Bible. And she herself said, ultimately, that she was the lesser light leading people to the greater light. So before we shift to the final but the foundation of all foundations, which is salvation in Jesus, and we've at least for this episode, we've purposely left it last because of the history that I'm going to mention here in just a moment. But tell us a little bit more about that important part, that Ellen White was always about leading people to Jesus, leading people to the Word of God, right? Tell us a little bit more about that. And then the impetus, like in a sense of her writings even had a deeper focus on Jesus, if I can say that in that way, specifically with books like Steps to Christ, and of course the classic Desire of Ages. That those are two books that whether you quote believe in Ellen White or not as a prophet, I highly encourage anybody to read at least those two books, right? Start there with the Steps to Christ and Desire of Ages. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think the books, as she said before she died, these will speak for me. Like they're her lingering voice. Early on, there was some phenomena associated with her visions. We talk about these sometimes. I don't have a 30-pound Bible here around me, but like she held up a Bible that was ridiculously heavy. Sometimes you can go to a general conference session and the White Estate or whoever has one of those Bibles, and they let you see how long you can hold it up. Can you beat Ellen's time? She would stop breathing, things like that. Doctors would come examine her while she was in vision and say she's not breathing. But she's standing upright and is fine. There was these phenomena that were associated with her early visions that were persuasive to people. Later on, those stopped. And to the point where even in 1919, if you'll indulge me for a minute, the General Conference president, Arthur Daniels, said something really, really remarkable. He said, I differ with some of the brethren who put together proofs or evidences of the genuineness of this gift He says, I believe that the strongest proof is found in the fruits of this gift to the church, not in physical and outward demonstrations. He says, I've heard some ministers preach and have seen it in writing that Sister White once carried a heavy Bible. I believe they said it weighed 40 pounds. It wasn't quite that heavy. But that's really to his point, because it's like, I've heard people say, oh, she did this and she did this. And he's like, if I showed up at these, Daniel's is like, if I showed up at these meetings and heard somebody making those claims, I don't know if that's why if I would believe that, I probably wouldn't. He says, I don't know whether that was ever done or not. I did not see it. I did not talk with anybody who ever did see it. Of course, this is 1919. This is a long time after Ellen White's early days. He says, I don't think that's the best kind of evidence, because you don't know how much of that is genuine or how much has crawled into the story, he says. But he's like, that's not the kind of proof that we want to use. And so for Daniels, it was, I know this woman, I've read her books, and I find her to be an inspired person, somebody who has this gift. That's how he drew that basis. It wasn't like, well, I heard somebody say to somebody who said to somebody that she, held this heavy Bible, or she didn't breathe, or whatever it may be. He's like, that's not the basis for my belief in her. The basis for my belief in her is I've read books like Steps to Christ and Desire of Ages, and I found them to bring me so near Jesus that I thought God had to have inspired this.
In other words, he was essentially saying that her writings and the relationship he had with her was the essence, that it didn't point to her. It pointed to Jesus, as you mentioned.
Yeah. So when people want to have this conversation today, the thing I tell them is just go read Desire of Ages.
Yeah.
And then we can talk, or go read Steps to Christ if you want something a little shorter, or Thoughts from the Mount of Blessings, or something like that. It's like, I don't know how anybody can read her writings and not realize, whatever else she may be in life, this woman loved Jesus.
Amen. Yeah.
You can't read her without coming to that conclusion. Like, she had insight into Jesus that just pulls your soul towards the Savior. Whatever you want to call that, I think having the gift of prophecy is an accurate, apt word to describe that. But that's what she did. That's the effect of her life's work.
Okay. So, coming full circle, by this time now, we have the 5 S's out of the 6 that this series, Foundation series, studies, right? So we have, or that we've talked about here. We've talked about the second coming. We've talked about the sanctuary. We've talked about the Sabbath, the state of the dead, and the spirit of prophecy. Now, it's important that as we turn to the foundation, as we finish this our time together here, I'll say it that way. Matthew, thank you for your time. We highly appreciate it. It's been a blessing just to have this conversation. But as we turn to the foundation, the topic of salvation, to understand, as George Knight, and we've been quoting him often here today, so it is a historical podcast, so I think people will have mercy on us. But he states, again, in the book Search for Identity, he says, 19th century Adventists lived in a largely Christian culture. They tended not to emphasize those beliefs they held in common with other Christians. 40 years of such evangelism, he says, right? So we're talking about, 1844, 45, 46 into the 80s, the mid-80s. 40 years of such evangelism led to a kind of separation between Adventism and basic Christianity. And then Knight goes on to say that Ellen White says that Adventists needed to preach the message of the gospel of his grace so that the world should no longer say that Seventh-day Adventists talk the law, but do not teach or believe Christ, right? So it just seems, Matthew, that it came to a time as they were progressing forward with their development of understanding these particular biblical beliefs that we've covered here at some level, that at some level they had lost the foundation of all foundations, Jesus Christ, right? So tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, you're absolutely right that Adventism found themselves in a really interesting place, because after 40 years of talking about what makes us different from other Christians, and there's nothing wrong with that. That was a really important thing to develop, right? Because if you're forming a new movement, you have to justify, why do we exist? Why are we not part of somebody else's movement? Yeah. So this was the emphasis for 40 years, and until the 1880s, when Ellen White made that statement. She made many other statements like that, where it's kind of like, we're dry as the hills of Gilboa. Our sermons are just so cerebral and it's just so devoid of Jesus and grace, because we've just taken that for granted for so long, and it's kind of like, yeah, I believe the Jesus thing. And what got her through this, we had this great big general conference in 1888 that many people are aware of. It was the culmination of years of debate within the church. And the debate was over these theological issues between Jones and Wagner on one side and Uriah Smith and George Butler, the General Conference president, on the other side. I mean, the details of that theology are not the most important part, at least as far as Ellen White's concerned, because for Ellen White, the problem here was that the spirit of Adventism was so dry that we're just going to fight to the death about some of these relatively minor. One of those issues was relatively a minor theological issue. Which of these 10 tribes historically met this fulfillment in Daniel chapter 7? Didn't really impact anything, but we're going at each other because we don't have a living experience of Jesus in our midst. Like, that was the problem. Not that we don't have the theology. You ask any Adventist back then, do you believe that you're saved by grace? And they would always say yes, right? We believe in Jesus. We believe he's saving us and all of these things, but they didn't have the living experience of that salvation. Yeah. And that's what Ellen White was trying to call the church to in the 1880s. This was a huge thing, because you have these confusing statements that church leaders were giving back then about how we're saved. Okay, the General Conference president said that the Adventist message is about the necessity of obedience to the law of God. Okay, I mean, in a certain way of looking at that, okay, I get it. We should obey God. But, it can kind of give the impression that that's what this is all about.
Yeah, we're saved that way.
Right. Yeah. Right. J.F. Ballinger, he says, when we obey, or it says, when we obey, that act of obedience, coupled with our faith, secures our justification.
Mercy.
Okay. And Uriah Smith said something very, 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 very similar, right? Because they would just point to it and they say, didn't Jesus say, if you love me, keep my commandments? So this faith in our works, like we didn't quite understand what the relationship is between them. We didn't want to be like other Christians where it's like, well, obedience doesn't matter. Just go, love God and do as you please. It's like, no, God does expect us to listen to him and to obey him and do the things that he asks us, like we all do, right? Like we do with our kids. We're like, hey, it's great that you love mom and dad, but also listen to mom and dad if you really love mom and dad, right?
Right.
We understand that, but like they had a really hard time understanding that relationship between our obedience and how that relates to our faith in God as pertains to salvation. And so that line got blurred tremendously. Yeah. That line got blurred. And so Ellen White's mission in the 1880s was to pull the church back from that and force us, or I should say focus us, to recommit to Jesus.
Right. And this is during this era is when she published Desire of Ages. And what was the date of Desire of Ages when it was published?
Well, Desire of Ages was the late 1890s. The first thing that she really did in 1892, I believe, was Steps to Christ. That was the first. Right. And so that began a whole decade of publications that were focused on Jesus. So she didn't just run around and preach sermons, right? Her publishing reflects her commitment to this. She said, by the way, in just a year after this 1888 General Conference meeting, she wrote this. She met with some pastors out west in America, and she said, many people seem to be ignorant of what constitutes faith. She told these pastors, in your talks and prayers, there has been so little dwelling upon Christ, his matchless love, his great sacrifice made in our behalf, that Satan has nearly eclipsed the views we should have and must have of Jesus Christ. And that's something I think that is timeless. She's saying that we're so worried about the devil and how he's trying to trick us and deceive us that in our sermon, she's saying we're focusing more on what he's doing and how we need to be worried about him and concerned about him, that he's taken the place in our sermons that Jesus should have.
And so as we are progressing along, right back to George Knight's statement, where we come to this time frame, the famous 1888, Minneapolis conference, that then propels forward, or continues, I should say, to propel forward the essence of righteousness by faith. And Ellen White's continued counsel to the time of her death in 1915, with the essence of Jesus, Jesus, lift up Jesus, the understanding of law and grace, that we are saved by faith through grace alone, period. Right. And through that, right, through the more that we fall in love with Jesus, the more, as you said, we are led to wanting to obey our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, right? And important to understand that. But that tension has continued. I mean, 1888 has had tons of books and articles, and of course, George Knight. Speaking of him, he has his book specifically on that and everything, and we'll link that to the show notes as well for people to have a better understanding of what led to the meeting and then the aftermath as well. But I want to ask you, Matthew, when it comes to, as I'm saying it, the foundation, Jesus, the foundation of all foundations, everything is about Jesus. And through him, all these other important beliefs derive from, right? It is the truth as it is in Jesus. What does that mean for you now today? All these years, whatever is 150 plus years later of the time frame that we're talking about in your ministry as a pastor, proclaiming righteousness by faith, proclaiming these other important truths. What is and bringing it all together? What does it mean for you in this current context?
It means that I need to keep the big picture in mind.
Mm,
Adventists have done a masterful job of saying, hey, we want to understand more of the Bible than is traditionally preached by other people. Daniel and Revelation, Ezekiel. We want to understand what all of this means. And sometimes we can get lost in the weeds.
mm,
And they're good weeds, right? They can be beautiful weeds. They can be whatever. But we can get lost in like the details. What does this one word mean? What does this one syllable mean? We can get down in there. And sometimes we can have our head so far down the hole or so close to the
mm,
page that we can lose sight of this big picture. That really the point of all of this, the point of Adventism itself, is to be looking up at the sky
mm,
and looking for Jesus. Like that's the whole point of this. That's why we began. We talk about the doctrine of the second coming, but really those guys who were waiting for Jesus to come in 1843, 1844 were people who were looking for Jesus
mm.
as a person. Like it was a relational thing. Like we want to see our friend, our Savior, our Creator, our Redeemer return to us and make all of this that we see around us, make it all right, make it all whole
So,
again.
so the second coming. Speaking of that, if I can jump in here, wasn't and shouldn't be this essence of like fear based, right? That sometimes they can
Yeah.
draw that. We understand it's going to be a time like no other, and certainly there's that aspect. And again, we can say a lot more about that. But ultimately, if our hope and faith is in Jesus, then we have nothing to fear, right?
Yeah.
Is that fair to say?
Yeah. I think that's fair to say. If you look at the second coming with fear in your heart, with uncertainty, then I would suggest that maybe you do a little bit of reflection that
Mm,
your heart isn't really with Jesus. We have to look at his return as if a friend is coming over to our house
mm,
and you peek out the window or you check your video doorbell if you have one of those. Like I heard a noise. Is he pulling up? Is he here yet?
yeah.
We got to look forward to it. When you really know Jesus, when he is your friend, when he is in your heart, his return is not a thing that is filled with trepidation or concern or inconvenience. It's like I can't wait for him to come over.
Yeah. So, there's a painting that I want you to tell us about, the Way of Life painting, that certainly I think reflects this. And again, going back to the essence of progressive understanding. And for those that are watching this on the video, they're going to be able to see the paintings, and what it looked like originally, and then what it came to look like. And then even what it looks like the final one, which was done in 1980, I believe. But
Hmm.
tell us a little bit about that when it comes to the emphasis of the foundation, Jesus Christ.
So these drawings are kind of a visual representation of the theological journey Adventism is on. They're trying to find, Adventism is a very evangelistic movement. We're always telling people about what we believe. And so charts were created, even in the Millerite movement, they had charts. And so these are some pictures that were made to kind of illustrate the whole sweep of this great controversy from getting Adam and Eve getting kicked out of the garden to the New Jerusalem in the end. And so it's kind of something a preacher could point to while they're talking and say, here's where we're at. This is what this is all about, that kind of thing. So Merritt Kellogg, who is a older half brother to John Harvey Kellogg, he commissioned this drawing in 1873.
And I'll jump in here. I think some people may not know, some people may have forgotten of who actually designed it, right? Painted it, which was, as you just mentioned, Merritt Kellogg, the older half brother of John Harvey Kellogg, right? And William Kellogg.
He commissioned it. He was a doctor. He was a pioneer of the Adventist work in California and elsewhere. And so he wanted this thing to illustrate what it is that Adventists believe, this grand story of the Bible. And so, you can look at it if you're watching on video. I'll do my best to describe it to you if you're listening on audio.
Yeah. But we'll have a link on the show notes for people to see it as well for those listening on the Restore podcast.
Perfect. But anyways, on the left, you see Adam and Eve being kicked out of the garden. You see Cain and Abel. You see the early sacrifices that are being offered. You have but it's dominated by this gigantic tree with 10 limbs. And these represent, of course, the 10 commandments. There's the first 4 commandments are hanging on one side, and the last 6 are hanging on the other side. In the middle, there is the all-seeing eye, which Adventists today look at and they're like, really?
Yeah.
But it just kind of symbolized the providence of God, right? That when it came to the law, God sees everything. There's no hiding anything from God. That was Merritt Kellogg's intention there.
And this was 1873, right?
1873, yep.
Okay.
And then next to that tree, almost very much eclipsed by that tree, is the cross. As Jesus hanging on the cross. The tree is much larger than Jesus. It's actually the center. You see these rays of light coming out from the eye, and so they kind of go across the sky, and they just draw your eyes in towards the law, not towards Jesus. But the intention was there, okay? The intention was to put the law and the cross next to each other. And, the prominence of the cross is very much designed into it. It's hard to tell a simple story saying, all these Adventists before the 1880s were legalists. No, like the prominence of the cross is there. The shadow it casts covers the sacrificial system. The priest who's administering the sacrifice is gesturing towards the cross. The man who's about to sacrifice a ram he has a knife in one hand, he's holding the ram in the other, but he's not looking at the ram, he's looking towards the cross.
Yeah.
So the cross was designed to be a very prominent feature, but I think it's almost like a Freudian slip that Adventists are like, the cross is important, but the tree with the law on it is bigger.
Yeah.
It's like, I don't think that was intentional to say we think the law is more important than the cross, but I think it was just kind of part of in the back of the Adventist psyche. That's how it ends up, right? Yeah. When they try to explain it, when they try to depict it. So, Kellogg published this thing. You see after the cross, you see a baptism and the Last Supper, these two kind of sacraments, for lack of a better word, which Adventists practiced. And then it moves on to a new heavens and a new earth. And Jesus returning the further you get on the side. But of course, the law is the central thing here.
And to be clear, it seems, and correct me if I'm wrong, so the original one was 1873. Then there was actually another one commissioned in 1876, correct?
Yes. And James White. Yeah.
Go ahead.
James White is like a typical choleric. He's like, he saw Merritt Kellogg's painting or his drawing, and he's like, I could do better.
Yeah.
I think we could tweak that a little bit.
That's before the 1881, which then has Jesus above all else, right? Which you can, you can see it on the link, or if you're on video, you'll definitely be able to see it. So,
right.
Tell us what led to that one, the one in 1880.
So James White's first one in 1876, he removed the eye, but largely it's pretty much the same. He made some changes throughout. Yeah. He gave the angel a lightsaber, which is cool. I wonder if the White Estate will sue George Lucas over that. I don't know.
Oh,
but anyways, So that was the change that he made there. But James kind of came to understand, as many Adventists were slowly waking up to the fact that, Jesus still is not the center of this thing.
Hmm.
And we tried to make him the center by putting the shadow of the cross over everything, but it's not. The law is still a pretty big thing. So James made plans to update this drawing one more time, and he was going to put Jesus at the center of it, but he passed away before he could be completed. So after his death, his son and his wife, Ellen, had commissioned the changes that James had wanted to make. And so this updated version, the 1883 version of this drawing, the first one I should mention was just called The Way of Life.
Yeah.
And then eventually it was called Christ the Way of Life. So even the name change was trying to put Jesus center in this thing. And here the law tree was removed, and the cross was made larger, was placed in the center of the drawing. Amen. Conceptually, it's still the same. You still have the sacrifices, the Garden of Eden, the Last Supper, the baptism, but the cross is placed in the center of this, where it belongs. And so I think it's kind of like this is a visual representation of the theological journey that Adventists had been on through these years. They're struggling through these iterations of this drawing of trying to put Jesus where he belongs. They're not successful the first few times, and they're kind of slowly waking up to it. And they got it in the end. Praise the Lord.
Amen. And we praise the Lord. And I think it's a good way to kind of almost land the plane here with that illustration, right? Which goes back full circle that we've been mentioning the essence of Knight's comment of progressive understanding. The picture was made in color, correct me if I'm wrong, right? As I mentioned earlier, 1980 by the White Estate. And people can, again, see that online. Beautiful picture. With Jesus as the center, Jesus, the foundation of all foundations, right? Everything, every belief and understanding is about Jesus that flows from him. And we do what we do, we share what we share. The essence of this series is all about Jesus. And even those truths are truths that we, as we've been talking here, have flowed from the Bible, from the Word of God, from Jesus, one would say as well. And so, Matthew, I first want to thank you for your time here and for guiding us and leading us through this historical journey and having some fun along the way. And I want to encourage people to listen once again to the Adventist History Podcast, a phenomenal podcast, a lot more of the history. There you go. We're going to give away some of those shirts on the Restore Podcast. So if you're watching, you may want to jump on that podcast, on the Restore Podcast, and give some information when that's released. But Matthew, any last words as we conclude?
I just think ending on salvation is a wonderful place to end. When Adventists, it's in the name right next to Sabbath. The Adventist part of our name is all about anticipating the return of Jesus. And I think it's important to realize that's a part of this journey of salvation. The cross is the center. He died for us. He lived for us. He rose for us. But we're not quite there yet, are we? We're saved by faith. When Jesus returns someday, we're saved in reality. Like we have a new heavens and a new earth. Right. There's no fear of death or pain or COVID anymore.
Amen.
And we're safe. So, I think part of what makes us, when we're Christ focused as Adventists, I think we have new eyes that we look towards the second coming. It's like, I want this salvation story to come to an end because I want to be with Jesus. I want to be where this painting depicts us in a new heavens and new earth with these animals. I want to wrestle a bear and have some haystacks in heaven.
Amen. Matthew, that's a great way to end. May God continue to bless you, your family, and once again, thank you for your time and your perspectives and your knowledge.
Thanks, Javier. It's been a pleasure being with you.